Thank you. Wow. All right. Well, that is one hell of a welcome. I guess I'm moving to Nebraska. So number one, I want to thank TPUSA for putting together this event. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I want to thank the university for making sure that we could actually do the event and providing the security necessary to make sure that the event could happen. I only wish that they'd been more quick to ensure that TPUSA could have a chapter over the last couple of years. But that said, it's wonderful that all of you are here. I had heard a rumor there are some folks who are here who disagree and are intending on getting up and walking out partway into the speech. I would encourage you to stick around and listen. You may actually hear something from which you can learn, or at the very least stick around and ask questions afterwards so we can have a discussion. Well, so tonight, because of everything that's been going on in the nation, normally I have my stump speech where I talk about various problems on college campuses, microaggressions and trigger warnings and all the rest. But tonight, because of the serious nature of what's been going on in the country with regard to guns and gun control, I decided that I think it's necessary, because I know the entire nation is listening. I know there are a lot of people who watch this stuff live, who are going to watch this later. And I think it's important that we actually go through the nature of gun rights, the nature of the Second Amendment, and why it is vital that we preserve the right to keep and bear arms. So let me begin with a quick note to all of our friends in the media and to all of our friends on the left. We do care when children are killed. We do care when innocent people are slaughtered. And this notion that if we disagree with you about gun control, this means we're on the side of the murderer is disgusting. Okay, the vast majority of people, I'm sure, in this room are supporters of gun rights. The vast majority of people in this room, I would venture to say everyone in this room, cares deeply and was wounded to the core of them over what happened in Parkland. We all care about innocent people suffering. The question is, how do we prevent that? And just because we disagree with the left on the best way to prevent the evil that happened in Parkland does not mean that we are uncaring or cruel or that we want to see children killed. And I don't care who makes that argument. I understand that there are a lot of people who were victimized in Parkland, people who are survivors of Parkland, and we have nothing but sympathy for them in the suffering that they went through. But being the victim of suffering does not give you the right to say disgusting things. And just because something bad happened to you doesn't mean that you get to go around and say about people who are law-abiding gun owners that they are in league with people who murder children. This makes you part of the problem, not part of the solution. A second note, I think that it's quite ironic that there are so many folks out there in the media who keep looking at Parkland and suggesting that this is a great reason for law-abiding citizens to come up with to give up their guns. So the FBI was warned twice, they did nothing. The Parkland Department was warned about 39 times, they did nothing. There was an armed deputy on scene, he did nothing. There may have been 3 more armed deputies on scene, they did nothing. And the solution is I'm supposed to give up my guns to those people? That's the solution, that I'm going to give up my gun to those authorities? Listen, I love our law enforcement officers, but they can't be everywhere at once, and they can't do everything. Do get made, and holes are sometimes there in the system, and that is why it is imperative that for your own self-defense, there be a right to keep arms, to keep and bear arms. Okay, I want a gun to protect myself and my children and not rely on outsiders who have to arrive after the shooting has begun. Okay, so the way that I'm going to go through this issue tonight, on the Second Amendment, I'm going to go through 5 separate aspects of this issue. First, we're going to talk about the constitutional basis of the right to keep and bear arms, what the Second Amendment is actually about, what the Constitution says about it. Then we'll talk about the status of current law, about which the media seems completely unaware. People in the media keep saying things like, you can just walk into a gun shop and buy a gun and walk out. Absolute nonsense. People keep saying things on CNN like you can buy an automatic weapon, no problem. They don't know the difference between a semi-automatic weapon and an automatic weapon, obviously, because that's not the law. And so we'll talk about the status of current law. Then we'll talk about the real statistics on gun violence, where the problem is, what's happened with gun violence, is it going up or is it going down? We'll talk about the effectiveness of particular gun control solutions, and then finally, we'll talk about what we can do. So we're going to cover this comprehensively before we get to the Q&A, which I know is the fun part. But I think it's imperative that we actually get to some of the root issues here. So let's start with the Constitution of the United States. So there's this rumor that's been going around on the left, that the Second Amendment has lived past its use date. that it's expired. There's no reason for us to worry about the right to keep and bear arms anymore. Well, the right to keep and bear arms is undergirded by two separate rights, the right to personal self-defense and the right to protect your rights. So the right to self-defense pre-exists government. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, philosophers who were respected by the Founding Fathers, particularly Locke, talked about the fundamental right of any human being being your right to self-preservation, your right to self-defense. And what Locke had to say about that was that when a government is formed, in a state of nature, you have the right to self-defense. When a government is formed, you don't give up that right to the government. Hobbes thought you gave up that right to the government. Now it was the government's job to protect you. Locke said it is the government's job to protect you, but that's just because the government can organize better. You do not give up your personal right to self-preservation when a government is formed. That right cannot be outsourced. It is inalienable. It's the right to life, liberty, property, according to John Locke, and as codified in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And it's the government's job to protect those rights, not to take away your own ability to protect your own rights. Okay, the right to protect your rights is the second right that is protected by the Constitution of the United States. The Declaration of Independence says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And the founders were very clear that this right included the ability to have arms. Alexander Hamilton wrote glowingly about the ability of people to own arms in Federalist 46. He praised, quote, the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. He, like all the other founders, saw ownership of arms as a check on tyranny. So, you need guns for two reasons. One, somebody's coming into your house, you need to shoot them. And two, you have a tyrannical government, and you must have the arms available to form what they call in the Constitution a well-regulated militia to prevent government tyranny and to prevent foreign intrusion. Now, the question is, does this logic still apply? Well, obviously, the first logic still applies. If someone's breaking into your house, you still need to be able to shoot them. And very few people will argue this point. Even folks on the left will generally not argue this point. But they say, how can an armed population prevent tyranny? Obviously, the federal government, God forbid, the federal government were to go tyrannical, what could we do as armed citizens to stop any of that from happening? And the answer is, an armed citizenry is the greatest preemptive check on the government going tyrannical in the first place. Meaning the government knows that if they were to go tyrannical, it would be very difficult to disarm all the people of Texas. And one of the reasons that you have a right to keep and bear arms is so that the government cannot take away your right to keep and bear arms, in other words. As to the notion that an armed population can't stop a greater superpower, unfortunately, I would give the examples of Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. The fact is that small arms can make all sorts of trouble for a larger, more well-armed enemy. And it is, again, worth noting that what it's really there for is the deterrent effect. And it has worked in American history before, sometimes for bad and sometimes for good. This is not to say that every use of arms against the government is a good thing. It is to say that if the government were to do something unquestionably evil, that the capacity of the people to stand up for that's a very important thing. And it does have an impact on public policy. Actually, the most recent example is what happened with the Bundy family, where you saw the Bundy family actually checking the excesses of the federal government, and then there was a mistrial in their trial. So basically, the federal government backed off. They were allowed to feed their cattle on what was public land, but they said they had a historic right to use that land. And there was essentially a hung jury. The jury said, okay, well, that's the right. And what happened as a result of all this? It was one factor in an election that brought about a president who decided to scale back the encroachment of the federal government into public lands. There's a history of that. That goes all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion, which took place in the late 18th century, that was an armed uprising against the federal government. It was put down. But the effect of it was that John Adams lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson and the whiskey tax was repealed. So in other words, it's a little bit more complex than the resisting force has to defeat the invading force. It's more about the idea that the federal government knows the cost of doing things that are too terrible. And that still holds true. And it's held true throughout history. The idea that a democracy cannot go tyrannical is belied by virtually every democracy in the history of the world, most of which have gone tyrannical at some point or another. And just on a moral level, people should be able to defend themselves against tyranny. And my entire extended family, my grandparents moved here, my great-grandparents moved here, but their extended family remained in Europe. They were slaughtered by the Nazis. I'm not suggesting that if all the Jews in Europe had had guns, they would have been able to stop the Nazis, but I am suggesting they would have been able to kill a lot more of the bastards before things went bad. So folks on the left try to look at the text of the Second Amendment. They try to suggest that the text of the Second Amendment means that there is no individual right to keep and bear arms, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, that's a complete misread. Okay? The misread that the left puts on this is that you have to be a member of the militia in order for you to keep and bear arms. This is a complete misread of history. It is utterly untrue. The meaning of this amendment was not in the slightest doubt at the time of the Constitution. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, there are already 8 states that had their own Bill of Rights. All of them guaranteed an individual right to keep and bear arms. One of the chief purposes of that right was to serve in militias that, again, could serve as a check against an overreaching federal government. Virtually all of these state constitutions said the same thing. Here's Pennsylvania's. The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their state. In New Hampshire, at the ratification convention for the Constitution, they passed this resolution. Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. The text of the Constitution is absolutely clear here. Every time the Constitution says the right of the people to do X, it is an individual right. The right of the people to be free from illegal search and seizure is not a right of us as a collective. It's an individual right against the federal government, as Justice Scalia says in D.C. versus Heller. So what regulations are possible? So the suggestion here is not that you should be able to own a nuclear missile or that you should be able to own a bazooka per se. Right? The suggestion here is that there are certain arms that clearly fall within the ambit of the Second Amendment. So the stupid idea that you've been hearing parroted on the media, that, for example, you don't have a right to a rifle under the Constitution of the United States, that you only have a right to muskets or flintlocks, and the weapons that were available at the time of the Second Amendment, this is just as stupid as saying that Twitter is not protected by the First Amendment because the founders didn't have the internet. What the founders meant is the arms that you need in order to protect yourself and protect your family and protect your community, those are the arms that you can have. And all the other arms might be subject to regulation. Because every right that we have has some regulation attached. Like, for example, there are time, space, and manner regulations with regard to the First Amendment. We couldn't just hold this assembly in the middle of the street today, right? There are time, space, and manner regulations with regard to the First Amendment. The same thing holds true with regard to the Second Amendment. There are certain things that can be regulated. So Justice Scalia holds that we can regulate dangerous and unusual weapons, but not weapons that are in common use, which is the current legal standard under the Constitution of the United States. I think that's even a little bit narrow. I think what the standard probably should be is weapons sufficient but not necessary to effectuate the formation of a militia, meaning what weapons you would need to form a militia, but not necessarily every weapon you could possibly want to have. Like, what's the minimum necessary? So this raises the final question on the Constitution. Does the Constitution protect AR-15s? Now, the media has this bizarre obsession with AR-15s, as though AR-15s are the only type of rifle in existence. Number one, the AR does not stand for assault rifle, you morons. It stands for Armalite. Second, if you were to ban the AR-15, there is no way to ban the AR-15 without banning every semi-automatic rifle in the United States, which is to say virtually every rifle in the United States. That does not withstand constitutional scrutiny, nor does it withstand common sense, considering there are 8 million AR-15s in circulation alone. So this is just stupid. And when the left says this, they don't mean it. They're just posturing. When Democrats say this, they're just saying this because they know that it's never going to get voted on, which is why from 2009 to 2011, when they ran the Congress, had 60 votes in the Senate and the presidency, they didn't do any of this stuff. Right? They wait until now to complain about it, so then they can claim that anyone who believes you should have the ability to own a rifle is actually a bad human being. This is the shtick that they're playing. It's really nasty. It's really gross. So, where is the law? What's the law as it currently stands? What you hear from the left is that it's easier to buy Sudafed than it is to buy a gun, or that you can just walk around no ID and purchase a weapon. It's the easiest thing in the world to buy a gun. This, of course, is not true. So before I get to what the status of the law is, a few terms that the media might need to know. A semi-automatic weapon is not an automatic weapon. There is also no CNN. There is no such thing as a full semi-automatic weapon. Semi-automatic weapon, for those who don't know, in the audience knows we're in Nebraska, right? We're not in California, where I live. Okay. Note to all of the anchors at CNN, a semi-automatic weapon is a weapon that fires once when you pull the trigger once and chambers around. Okay, that's all a semi-automatic weapon is. An automatic weapon is you hold the trigger down and lots of bullets fire. This is not difficult. Stop misusing the terms. You sound stupid. When people say assault rifle, an assault rifle generally means a machine gun. These have been illegal in the United States essentially since 1986. Okay? Assault weapon is a term that means nothing. Assault weapon is a bizarre legal term of art that means that you add a couple of features to a normal rifle, so you can have a rifle that looks not scary and it's not an assault weapon, and you paint it black and you add a pistol grip and suddenly it's an assault weapon. which is why the assault weapons ban of 1994 made no sense and had no impact on gun violence in the United States. And silencers, the bunch of people who are arguing that silencers are super dangerous and acting like silencers do what they do in the movies, where it sounds like every time you fire a bullet. Okay, that's not what a silencer does. It is still just as loud as a jackhammer. Yeah. Okay, so here is what the law is right now. When it comes to assault rifles, when it comes to machine guns have been effectively banned in the United States since 1986. Technically, legal machine guns must be manufactured before 1986, and the government began keeping track of all sales and manufacture of machine guns in 1934. So it's been a little while since we've had to worry deeply about the threat of machine guns in the United States. Assault weapons were banned in 1994 under Dianne Feinstein's ridiculous law, and that had essentially no impact on overall gun violence by studies, since rifles typically are not used in crime anyway. Rifles are used far less often in crime than handguns are. As far as background checks, to legally buy a weapon, okay, again, there's no such thing as a gun show loophole. To legally buy a weapon from a federally licensed firearms dealer in the United States, you must show ID and you must go through a federal background check. The dealers send your information to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. There is no loophole here for gun shows. The only quasi-loophole that exists is a private citizen selling a gun to another private citizen. In order to close that loophole, you would have to have a gun registry and identify every gun in the United States, which is probably unconstitutional and certainly is bad policy. Okay, fine. Okay, now let's get to the real gun violence statistics. So what we've been hearing is gun violence is constantly on the increase. People are being murdered on a scale that boggles the imagination. School shootings are increasing, and your child is, if not likely going to die, has a high likelihood of being shot at a school. This is not true. Okay, gun deaths in the United States have been radically declining since 1993. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there were 7 gun-related homicides for every 100,000 Americans in 1993. By 2013, that number had been sliced in half to 3.6 homicides per 100,000 population. During that same period, the number of privately owned firearms in the United States doubled, from 185 million to 357 million privately owned firearms in the United States. So the number of arms in the United States was going like this, and the amount of gun crime in the United States was going like that. And yet everybody in the media seems to assume that more guns means more crime. You're going to have to explain then why more guns does not mean more crime. Okay, where do all of these... also, quick note, they say there are 33,000 gun-related deaths in the United States. They neglect to mention that 2/3 of these are suicide. About 8,000, 9,000 gun-related homicides in the United States. The vast majority of gun-related deaths are people who are killing themselves. And it is very easy to substitute another method for killing yourself. Okay. Where do gun-involved deaths take place? So the idea from the left is that states that have lax gun laws have higher rates of gun crime. This is not true. Gun-involved deaths take place in mostly America's major cities. So all those hicks from the sticks, the people who actually own all the guns, those aren't the people who are killing each other. Okay, this is all happening in cities, in major American cities. Virtually all of these major American cities are governed by one party, and I will let you guess which party that is. Almost 60% of all American firearm homicides occur in the 62 cities of the country's largest metros. In order of gun homicide, gun-related death: New Orleans, Detroit, Las Vegas, Miami, Baltimore, St. Louis, Richmond, Memphis, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. That is 9 Democrat mayors and 1 Republican mayor, the only Republican being in Miami. The single strongest predictor of rates of gun death by a wide margin is actually race, unfortunately. Okay, Richard Florida writes, the share of the population that is black is positively related to both the overall rate of gun death and even more so with gun-related homicides. Now, let it be noted, I am not suggesting that black people are inherently more likely to kill each other because that's stupid and racist. What I am suggesting is that culture has a high likelihood of causing homicide. And culture differs. Okay, you can look in poor white communities. There's a higher rate of homicide there as well. Cultural issues and poverty in major American cities factor into gun death. Guns are not the chief reason for gun death. In other words, you need bad people picking up guns in order for those guns to fire themselves. I have 2 guns at home. I have a 9mm and I have a shotgun. Neither one of them has killed anyone. Neither one of them has popped out of my safe and shot anyone. And neither one of them is going to, because it's my safe and I have the key. Okay, rifles versus handguns. People keep talking about banning rifles. The left is very focused on banning rifles, which is a really weird thing to do when you think about it, considering that rifles are not more dangerous than handguns. In 2014, there were 8,100 total firearm homicides. Fully 5,500 were committed with a handgun. 248 total were committed with a rifle. Okay, so you're significantly more likely to die, if you're in a gun-related incident, from a handgun gunshot than you are from a rifle gunshot. And you're more likely to die from a blunt object, from being hit with a fist, than you are to be killed by a rifle. 660 people that year were killed with hands or fists, or feet, like Bruce Lee, right? How about the idea that rifles are inherently more dangerous? Of course, rifles have a greater muzzle velocity. Of course that's true. That's what rifles are made for, but that is not what is predominantly used in crime. And as for school shootings, the idea that school shootings are on the rise is also not true. There was a study that came out just in the last couple of days showing that the number of school shootings has actually been in significant decline. Since 2012, according to the Gun Violence Archive, 138 people have been killed in school shootings. That does include the Parkland Massacre, and it includes any incident that took place on a school campus during times where students or faculty were on the ground. So somebody shot themselves. It wasn't even a mass shooting. It's 138 people total. So between 15 and 20 people per year are killed on school grounds, which means that 2.6% of all youth homicides occur at school. Your child is about 40 times more likely to die from getting into your medicine cabinet or into some other household product than they are from being shot after you drop them off at school, as Leon Wolf points out over at the Blaze. And according to researchers at Northeastern University, mass school shootings are extremely rare. 4 times as many children were killed in schools in the early 1990s as they are today. None of this is to make light of anything that's happened. None of this is to suggest that every school shooting is not a tragedy, but it is to suggest that the lie that is being promulgated out there, that there's a school shooting every day in America. You heard this. There were 18 school shootings, 18 mass shootings in the first month of the new year. It's just not true. It's just a lie. It's made up. Every town for gun violence, for gun safety, puts this stuff out, and it's not true. It's statistically false. Mass shootings more broadly are also not happening all that often in the United States. In fact, on a per capita basis, the United States does not rank number 1 in deaths from mass shooting in the Western world. Okay, actually, the United States ranks 11th. From 2009 to 2015, here are countries that ranked above the United States in mass shooting deaths rates per million. Norway, Serbia, and France. Mass shooting frequency, we rank number 12, after Austria, France, Switzerland, and Norway. And here's the thing about using mass shootings as a proxy for this discussion anyway. Mass shootings are a really bad way to go about having a gun control discussion because they are not representative of gun violence in totality. The victims tend to be younger. The victims tend to be more racially diverse. The perpetrators tend to be a little bit younger. Most gun murder victims are between the ages of 15 to 34, for example. 2/3 of those gun victims are black in the United States. Okay, in mass shootings, it's racially diverse. So why are we using mass shootings as a proxy to have a discussion about broader gun violence? It doesn't make any sense, except that the media like to choose hotspot, really ugly incidents they can focus on so that then they can claim that all of us don't have sympathy for people who were killed. Okay, now, finally, we get to the key issue, the efficacy of gun control. Does gun control actually stop gun violence? So first, let's point out a quick statistic. Violence statistics, not just gun violence statistics, violence statistics matter. Okay, it is true that if you have an armed population, in many cases, you have a more polite population. According to PolitiFact, which is a far-left source, for England and Wales, the rate of violent crimes is 775 per 100,000 people. For the United States, that rate is 383 violent crimes per 100,000 people. The UK has double the violent crime rate of the United States, according to PolitiFact, and they have virtually no guns in their society. How about gun control in other nations? What you would expect is, again, this one-to-one correlation, because people keep suggesting over and over and over, more guns means more crime. Okay, let's look at the European countries. Let's take the United States completely out of it. Okay, the gun homicide rate in the United States, first of all, has declined faster than Australia's did after its gun buyback and ban program. And it's hard to measure the impact on mass shootings of Australia's gun buyback program because there were so few mass shootings before that. But if you look at gun control in other nations, right, the Small Arms Survey of 2007 estimates civilian ownership of firearms by nation. The United States ranks by far at the top. We have 101 guns per 100 residents. Number 8 is Norway. Norway has 31 guns per 100 residents. France is 9th. The UK ranks 82nd. So the UK doesn't have virtually any guns. Norway has a lot more guns. Okay, yet Norway is near the bottom of the list in terms of homicide rate, just 0.56 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, and France ranks somewhere near the middle of the pack. They have triple the homicide rate of Norway, but they have way fewer guns, which suggests that maybe this has very little to do with guns, and it has a lot more to do with the population that is in your country. And you see this in the United States too. Right? There are states, there's no correlation whatsoever between a state having a high firearm ownership rate and a high crime rate. So the 10 lowest homicide jurisdictions in the United States are New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Massachusetts, Utah, Minnesota, Maine, Hawaii, Idaho, and Wyoming. 6 of those 10 states earn a D or an F from the Brady campaign on gun control. Meaning if you go to Vermont or New Hampshire, everybody has a gun and there's no gun violence. And the reason for that is because the people in Vermont and New Hampshire are not shooting each other. This is really not all that difficult. And when you look at the other end of the spectrum, when you look at the states that do have high rates of gun violence, there are a bunch of states, actually, that have a lot of gun control. And, of course, everybody in the Second Amendment community is familiar with localities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago. Okay, so with all of this said, what can we actually do? So people on the left like to say that we don't have any solutions here on the right. All we want to do is obstruct. All we want to do is prevent you from doing anything that would really matter. And so we have Jimmy Kimmel out there whining, and we have Jimmy Fallon out there talking about his virtue, and we have Stephen Colbert doing whatever it is that Stephen Colbert does for a living. And we have all of these late-night hosts pretending they know the first thing about guns, which they don't, and pretending they know the first thing about these statistics, which they don't. But they don't have to do the research. After all, they feel the right things. And that's all that matters. They feel correctly. Okay, so what they say is that we don't present any solutions. Okay, so here are a few solutions that people on the right have presented. And they make a lot more sense than trying to ban 300 million firearms in the United States from 100 million gun owners, which makes no sense, is never going to happen, and is just being thrown out there for the sake of making political hay. So one of the proposals that's been put forward is gun violence restraining orders. It's put forward by my friend David French at National Review. Essentially what this would allow is for you, with due process of law, it would allow you and your friends to go and you see somebody in your family, a friend who is mentally ill, dangerous to himself and others, you could go to a court, you could petition to have that person's Second Amendment rights temporarily suspended, and it would have to be re-upped on a regular basis with new evidence that this person was still a threat to themselves or others. And this is something that's already been implemented in several states. The second, probably most important thing we could do is actually enforce the laws on the books. We all know about the failures at Parkland, right? How many laws were violated, and yet nothing happened? How many times were we warned about the shooter in Parkland, and yet nothing happened? And this is not uncommon. I mean, the federal government blew it in the Texas shooting. The federal government blew it in Sandy Hook. The federal government blew it in the Charleston mass shooting. Over and over and over, you see situations in which facts were not reported from one agency to the other, and then we're told if we just give them more authority, then everything gets healed. That, of course, is not true. We know that as of 2013, out of 48,321 cases against straw buyers, people who go in and falsely purchase a gun in order to hand it to somebody who can't legally have a gun, out of those 48,000 cases, the federal government had prosecuted 44. 44. And then they talk about they need more authority. They can't even handle the authority they have. As of 2013, there were 20,000 people in my stupid state, California alone, who were not legally allowed to own guns, but owned them anyway. And at the time, the state of California had staffed, I believe, 30 people to go out and remove 20,000 guns from these folks. Good luck on that. Okay, states also are not reporting people who should be barred from owning and buying guns to the feds. 38 states submit less than 80% of the records that they are legally bound to submit to the federal government. Okay, so with all of this on the books, you need to actually enforce the laws on the books before you claim that you have a lack of authority. Hey, here's something else that can be done, and this is what I've called on the media to do. Studies suggest that mass shooters are generally egged on by media coverage. So over-the-top media coverage, lots of coverage of the shooter, using the shooter's name, using the shooter's picture, talking about every aspect of what the shooter wants you to talk about. This causes people to obsess, mentally ill people to obsess, and then to go out and commit mass shootings. So what we at the Daily Wire have done is we won't show the names and we won't show the faces and we won't talk about the identity of mass shooters. We should have adopted that policy a long time ago, but we reconsidered our position in the light of new evidence and some of the studies that have come out, and so now we're doing it. So the question is, why aren't the mainstream media even considering it? Why is it the same mainstream media who are willing to sit by and watch Senator Rubio get slandered on national television as akin to a mass shooter? Those same people who are willing to sit by and listen as shooting survivors talk about how members of the NRA are evil and want to kill children, those same people will show every single day a picture and name of the mass shooter in Parkland. There's something they can be doing, and they're not doing it right now. So why don't the media actually put their money where their mouth is instead of just relying on the government to fill the gap they think ought to be filled? Conservatives obviously have talked about heightened school security, from arming qualified teachers, not every teacher, qualified teachers. I mean, Coach Aaron Feist died throwing his body in front of bullets. It would have been better if he'd been armed. I think that's rather uncontroversial. Okay, people should not have to throw their bodies in front of bullets. They should be able to have the capacity, if they are qualified, to have a gun to protect themselves. Heightened school security is a necessity. I went to a private school in Los Angeles. My private school in Los Angeles, the Jewish Day School, it was located next to the Holocaust Museum on Pico Boulevard. And in 1999, there was a mass shooter and the mass shooter drove past our high school and saw that we had armed guards, saw that the museum had armed guards, and he just kept driving. He drove over to a JCC that had no armed guards and proceeded to shoot up the JCC. The point there being that, I mean, I was at the school at the time, the point there being that school security actually does dissuade mass shooters very often from doing what it is that they are seeking to do. And I don't mean one armed security guard. I mean a lot of armed security guards carrying and walking around the halls, and all this nonsense from the left. Oh my God, if a kid sees a gun, they're going to be scarred for life. I'll tell you what's a little more scarring. Okay, there are a few things that are a little more scarring than seeing law enforcement officers walking around your school maintaining law and order and ensuring that nobody walks in with a gun. Okay, one of those things, a mass shooter coming in there and murdering children. A little more scarring, I would think. And finally, and this is a bigger issue, we do need a mass awakening with regard to morality in this country. One of the things that is creating One of the things that's creating this spate of dispossessed young men, disillusioned young men who are walking to schools and shooting people up, yes, a lot of these folks, a disproportionate number of these folks, are growing up in single-parent families where the father is not present in the home. But more importantly, we as a culture have denigrated manhood. We've denigrated what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a man. It's so funny. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about rape culture and Me Too and Time's Up and all of this. And what we keep hearing from people on the left is teach your boys not to rape. Now, I would like to see a show of hands, a lot of young men in here. I assume that none of you are rapists. If you are, please leave or turn yourself into the police. But I assume that of all of you who have not raped anybody, your show of hands, how many of your parents said to you, do not rape? Like actually said those words to you, do not rape. Right? Nobody. And yet, magically, no one in here is a rapist. Okay, so this do not rape nonsense is a failure. What your parents probably did teach you is be a gentleman. Protect women. Protect children. It is your job to be the sheepdog, right, in the American sniper model. It is your job to be a protector. Part of being a man means protecting other people, not being a victimizer and not being a victim. Conservatism needs a resurgence because morality and virtue have been completely lost in our public debate. These things have been put to the side. We've been told that the government can fill every gap. The government can save you from every bad thing that's going to happen to you. It can't. A virtuous citizenry, an armed virtuous citizenry, is the most dangerous thing to both tyranny and vice. An armed virtuous citizenry is what stands between civilization and darkness. But both of those things have to be true. You need an armed citizenry, but that citizenry can damned well be virtuous. And that's where it comes in. That's where we have to do better in teaching our own children. That's where conservative morality matters. That's where Judeo-Christian values matter. That's where the use of reason matters. That's where we have to stop teaching our children that they're victims of the system and start teaching them that responsibility starts with them. And they have to take responsibility for their own actions. Virtually no evil human being in the history of the world has thought that they were an evil human being. Virtually every human being who is evil, who's done true evil to another human being, thinks that they were a victim. We need to stop growing a society of victims. We need to stop telling kids that they are victimized. We need to stop telling kids that they don't have an obligation to overcome whatever obstacle they are facing with our help, and then go forward and do something great, like protecting innocent people. If you don't give young men something valuable to do, they will do something very bad. I have a 2-year-old son. He does 2 things. He builds with his blocks, and he knocks them over. Okay, this is true of every man who has ever been created. Okay, men only do 2 things. They build or they destroy. And if we are not teaching young men to build, they will destroy. So bottom line, I think we can come to some solutions across the aisle. I think that we can agree on a lot of the things that I've talked about if people are willing to put aside the partisan political bickering, if they're willing to put aside the virtue signaling and the moral posturing and get past the idea that people who disagree with them on policy are nasty human beings, because these seem relatively uncontroversial. Teaching men to be better human beings, arming school guards, ensuring that mentally ill people with due process cannot get guns, right? Doing all of those things, these should be no-brainers. And yet we're stuck. And the reason we're stuck is because there are too many people who, for their own purposes, feel better about themselves if they can castigate you as bad people because you own a gun or because you've once fired a gun or because you know what a gun is. And this is coming from a person who grew up on the coast and did not own a gun until I was 23 years old. Right? The reality is the people on the coast, unfortunately, and especially in the media, have a severe cultural dislike for people who know and like guns, who have grown up with guns, who know how to defend themselves. That has to stop, because we can't come to any agreement on what to do until we can come to an agreement that we are all members of the same American family and that we all want the same thing, to protect innocence and to promulgate virtue. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.